So we are now here in Cape Town, South Africa, Stellenbosch University. I have here Dr. Morne Mostert, Director of the Institute for Future Research. Welcome to this interview.
Thank you so much.
So I'd like to ask you, based on your long work with companies and clients, you have special expertise in corporate foresight. So what is the, how do you see, what is the best means for making the companies understand the critical importance of future thinking for their strategy and for their competitiveness?
I think corporations are particularly strange creatures. They're strange entities. They, on the one hand, are responsible to their staff internally, and on the other, to their shareholders externally. And then, of course, they're responsible to their customers to provide the best possible quality service that may represent value. So the time interpretation of the responsibility of corporations is one of the particular interests of mine. And helping organizations, corporations, to think about the longitudinal implications of their decisions is, I think, now more important than ever. We've seen many examples in the last few decades of corporate irresponsibility, yes, as it may affect the society, the environment, and indeed the broader economy. More and more now, corporations are starting to think of themselves, of course, as citizens, a kind of citizen. And so citizenry means that you have a relationship with a country, and a country has theoretically an endless life cycle. Yes. And so the relationship between a corporation and a country, I think, is one of the ways to help companies to think about how they should think a little bit more long-term. Of course, they're under all kinds of pressure, quarterly reporting literally every 92 days. And those pressures do make it difficult for them to make long-term decisions. But they can take their shareholders, their staff, their customers and suppliers on a long-term journey with them.
Exactly, very good. So very important to realize the importance of long-term, and as you mentioned, this big picture and also cultural context where they are situated.
Correct.
For the business. Then another question that intrigues me, I'd like to hear your answer. Can you give me an example of a line of business or business sector here in South Africa that has seriously adopted futures thinking, or at least to some degree systematically introduced futures thinking in their work?
Well, I think it's very difficult, in fact, to measure the return on investment for any specific consulting investment. If you think about any kind of methodology, Six Sigma, business process re-engineering, whatever it might be, they all claim to be solely responsible. I think the reality is that organizational success is a systemic emerging property rather than the result of only one outcome. But we work with both government and largely the corporate sectors, as you've said. And what we find is that founders of organizations are a little bit more willing to think about the longer term. It's a really fascinating discovery to me, because founders tend to be driven by purpose. And purpose has a longer life cycle. Profit can be really kind of short-term and sometimes even opportunistic. But purpose allows for a longer-term perspective, and that's often where founders, I think, have an opportunity to make sure that that founding principle survives into the future, without, of course, falling prey to the idea of founder's trap, in which the founder thinks that they still know all the answer as the business evolves.
Yeah, but in a way this highlights the necessity that we would need transformational leadership.
Indeed so.
Yeah. So then moving towards the methodology, as you mentioned methods, what are your personally favorite methods that you use in your foresight work?
We do a lot of work, as some of our academic colleagues say, in the real world. In other words, real executives, often driven by very short-term goals, sometimes cynical by the time they become senior, if I'm being brutally honest. And why I'm mentioning that is that the luxury for being purist in terms of methods is actually very rare in our experience. So the reality is that we always have a hybrid model. Now, my background is particularly in systems thinking. And systems thinking, one way to think about systems thinking is that it is in fact simply an example of thinking. And thinking is the number one determinant of high quality decision making. So we often use systems maps to try to understand the landscape and then to think about how that ecology, that business ecology, is likely to evolve into the future. So we've done a lot of work here to think about how systems thinking can act as a method for longer term decision making. I also, perhaps not unusual for futurists, love the idea of confronting people with their own paradigms. And we've developed a series of core paradigms through which we ask a series of fundamental questions, and that very often unearths how people think about what's possible.
Okay, that kind of like questioning.
Indeed, Socratic, if you like.
Very good. And then moving more towards the whole field of futures research. Actually, what do you see as the greatest challenge for developing the field of futures research? Because it cannot be at a standstill. We always develop methods, we develop frameworks, we develop goals. So what is, if you should mention the great challenge for the present situation, how to develop futures research?
It really depends on your vantage point. From my perspective, futures science is, to a very large degree, not all that different from cognitive sciences. It's really about the ability and willingness to make meaningful, longer-term decisions. I think one of the very exciting avenues that we're exploring now is brain-based research.
Yes.
And how decision-making is in fact affected by the way in which you manage your own brain and how knowledge of your brain may help you to make better decisions. In addition to that, I also love the development in the process of various modalities of thinking. So I've mentioned systems thinking, but I think there's an opportunity to think about how systems thinking is related to other elements, such as creative thinking, innovation thinking, strategic thinking, futures thinking as its own discipline, if you like, and a number of ways in which cognitive processing may be refined as a means of making more meaningful longer-term decisions.
Yes, you really hit the point here, because of course our field is already multidisciplinary, but more and more cognitive science are like approaching futures research or vice versa.
Yeah, very exciting.
And the most recent findings show that actually in the brain, the place where you have memories of past experiences is exactly the same location where you have the capacity to imagine future.
Isn't that absolutely fascinating?
Yeah.
So in psychology, one of the really disturbing implications of that finding is that people can in fact create memories. They can imagine having had certain experiences which they may or may not have had. But I do think though that there is a word of caution that I give to scholars of brain-based research, because I think the dilemma for using brain architecture as a methodology to advance futures thinking, it's a little bit like trying to teach someone how to swim by pointing out on a map where the rivers are.
Yeah.
The fact that you know where the wet bits are doesn't make you an Olympic swimmer. So the fact that you know brain architecture, that in itself does not allow you better decisions. It simply provides you a map.
Yeah, it's not enough. You have to teach the skills.
That's right.
So now that we are here in South Africa, it's only appropriate that the last final question, last but not least, concerns Africa and the future of Africa. So what is actually, to your opinion, the biggest challenge for the future of Africa?
We have such a short amount of time, and of course the dilemma of Africa is anything you can say the opposite and it's also true. Africa's poor, but Africa is also very rich. Africa has enormous opportunity, and yet Africa has enormous underdevelopment. In South Africa, there's a very strong political focus on what's often known as the three problems of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. Inequality, poverty, and unemployment. I do think, though, that overemphasizing that has some risks. And one of the key risks, to my mind, is that those problems should often be systemically addressed in other places. So, for example, inequality is not necessarily alleviated, and this is a highly contentious idea. Inequality is not necessarily alleviated by working only towards equality. It may also be alleviated by developing strategies for growth. And so, in a certain sense, one of the challenges for the future of Africa is the paradigm of its leaders. There's some research that suggests that the average age of political leaders in Africa is over 66. And yet the average population age on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa is somewhere around 20 or 21. And so you can imagine that presents us with at least potentially conflicting views of how the future might be developed. And I think a key constraint there is that a lot of current political leadership, in fact, derive their power from the past. Very often, the liberation role that they played in the history of Africa. Whereas what is at least partially now required for Africa is a design of Africa's future, an exploration of where the opportunities are, and a meaningful role for Africa in the rest of the world. That paradigm shift, I think, is critical to how the continent may develop.
Yes, indeed, and as you pointed out, this is really a systemic view is needed, tackling this nexus of complex issues. So definitely, and also, as you pointed out, the question of leadership. Mm-hmm. So all these together are required to explore this issue and also find solutions. So Dr. Morne Mostert, thank you very much for this interview.
What a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.